The political shockwave nobody in Washington saw coming detonated at full force this week, and the reverberations are still rattling the corridors of power from Capitol Hill straight to the Oval Office. What was supposed to be a display of dominance, a carefully engineered moment of pressure designed to bend a neighboring nation to the will of the most powerful office on earth, collapsed spectacularly in front of a global audience. And it was dismantled not with a lengthy rebuttal, not with a press conference, not with diplomatic maneuvering behind closed doors. It was dismantled with three words. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, the former Bank of England and Bank of Canada governor, who entered politics with a reputation for measured, data driven composure, stood before reporters and cameras and delivered a response so surgically precise, so utterly calm, that it stopped conversations mid sentence in Washington's most powerful rooms. Canada is ready, he said. Three words: clean, cold, composed, and devastating. The backdrop to this moment had been building for weeks. Tariff threats, annexation rhetoric, and economic ultimatums had been issued with increasing aggression, framed as leverage over a country that has been America's closest trading partner and neighbor for generations. The pressure campaign was loud, relentless, and designed to signal that Canada had no real options, that economic pain would force compliance, humility, and ultimately capitulation. It was a bet that the new Canadian Prime Minister would flinch. He did not flinch. What Carney's three-word response communicated was not just confidence, it was strategic. It was a signal to financial markets, to NATO allies, to the European Union, and to every government watching this confrontation unfold that Canada had absorbed every threat thrown at it and had emerged not shaken, but prepared. The response carried the subtext that Canada had diversified trade routes, shored up its economic resilience, and coordinated with international partners, all before the ultimatum had even finished echoing across the border. Sources close to the Canadian government confirmed that Carney had spent weeks quietly conducting diplomatic outreach across Europe, Asia, and within NAFTA successor frameworks, methodically constructing an alternative economic architecture that reduced Canada's vulnerability to any single point of pressure. When the ultimatum landed, Canada had already built the runway to fly without it. Washington, by multiple accounts, was not prepared for this. Insiders familiar with the administration's strategy described a plan that relied heavily on the assumption that economic dependence would translate into political submissiveness. Canada sends the vast majority of its exports to the United States. The logic, such as it was, held that there was simply no world in which a Canadian leader could absorb tariff pressure, smile, and say, "We're ready." That calculus has now been exposed as dangerously flawed. The international reaction was swift and stinging. European Commission officials, who had been quietly watching the Canada-US standoff as a kind of geopolitical weather vane, issued statements expressing admiration for Carney's composure and reaffirming interest in expanded trade cooperation with Ottawa. German trade ministers, French economic advisors, and UK officials all signaled openness to fast-tracking bilateral arrangements that would further cushion Canada against North American trade disruptions. In short, the pressure campaign accelerated the very diversification it was meant to prevent. Political analysts across the spectrum noted the extraordinary optics of the moment. A former central banker, not a career politician, not a populist firebrand, but a technocrat known for spreadsheets and monetary policy, had walked onto the world stage and with three words reframed the entire power dynamic of one of the most consequential bilateral relationships on the planet. The contrast was stark. Loud ultimatums met with quiet readiness. Volume answered with stillness. Threat answered with preparation. Within hours of Carney's statement circulating globally, it became the most shared political clip across social media platforms in over a month, trending in countries that have no direct stake in Canadian-American trade policy. The message resonated far beyond its immediate context. It struck a chord with leaders in smaller nations who have watched powerful countries issue pressure campaigns and wondered whether dignified resistance was even possible. Carney had given them an answer. Back in Washington, the silence in certain offices was telling. No immediate counterstatement, no escalation of the tariff threat to a new level, no fresh ultimatum designed to overshadow the optics of the previous one backfiring. Just silence, which, in Washington terms, speaks volumes. When a pressure campaign is met with silence from the aggressor, it typically means one of two things: recalibration or retreat. Either way, the initiative had shifted. What makes this moment historically significant is not just the outcome of a single exchange. It is what it reveals about the evolving architecture of geopolitical leverage in a fragmented global order. For the better part of a century, proximity, military alliance, and economic integration with the United States has meant that neighboring countries navigate disagreements through quiet diplomacy and careful deference. The assumption was always that direct public defiance carried costs too steep to absorb. Carney's 3 words and the weeks of preparation that gave them their force suggest that calculus is changing. Canada, it turns out, had been doing its homework while the ultimatums were being drafted. And when the moment came, it didn't need a lengthy speech. It didn't need pointed rhetoric. It didn't need to match aggression with aggression. It needed exactly 3 words to communicate that the threat had been studied, anticipated, and neutralized. The broader lesson being drawn in foreign ministries around the world this week is one about the new geometry of power. That preparation is its own kind of deterrence, that composure under pressure is its own kind of strength, and that sometimes the most devastating political response is the one delivered with absolute calm. Washington has been silenced before, but rarely this efficiently. There is a particular kind of power that the world rarely gets to witness in real time. Not the power of volume, not the power of threat, not the power of resources deployed with maximum noise and visible aggression, but the quiet, almost unsettling power of a person who saw the storm coming long before anyone else and spent every available moment building shelter. That is precisely what unfolded on the world stage this week, and it rewrote in a single composed moment everything that conventional political wisdom assumes about how smaller nations are supposed to behave when the largest economy on Earth turns its pressure apparatus in their direction. The assumption embedded in every ultimatum ever issued by a dominant power to a dependent neighbor is a simple one: that dependence creates compliance. It is a logic that has governed geopolitical relationships for centuries, and it is not without historical foundation. When your largest trading partner controls the destination of the majority of your exports, when integrated supply chains run like arteries across a shared border, when decades of economic architecture have been deliberately constructed around mutual reliance, the expectation from the side wielding the ultimatum is that the other side will eventually calculate the cost of resistance and find it too steep. The pressure doesn't even need to be subtle. It just needs to be sustained long enough for the math to become undeniable. What that logic fatally underestimates, however, is what a sufficiently prepared government can accomplish in the window between the first threat and the final demand. Preparation is not merely a tactical response to pressure. In the right hands, it is its own form of deterrence. Invisible until the moment it becomes irrefutable, and by then, it is already too late for the aggressor to recalibrate without losing face. Mark Carney understood this not as a politician, but as someone who had spent his career managing systemic risk, reading the signals that precede financial crises, and constructing institutional buffers before the damage could propagate. He brought that same discipline to the political arena, and the results were unlike anything Washington's pressure strategists had modeled. While the ultimatums were being drafted, while the tariff threats were being escalated for maximum psychological effect, and while analysts in Washington were confidently predicting that economic reality would eventually bend Canadian resolve, something else entirely was happening on the other side of the border. Diplomatic cables were being sent across the Atlantic. Trade frameworks dormant for years were being quietly dusted off and re-examined. European counterparts who had their own grievances with aggressive unilateralism were being invited into careful, unhurried conversations about what a more diversified trade architecture might look like. None of it was announced. None of it was performed for cameras. It was simply work. Meticulous, unglamorous, strategically essential work. By the time the ultimatum arrived in its final form, Canada had already done the most important thing any nation facing economic coercion can do. It had reduced the cost of saying no. Not eliminated it. The cost was still real, still significant, still something that would require sacrifice and adaptation. But it had been reduced to a level where absorbing it became a viable political and economic choice rather than an existential threat. That distinction is everything. An ultimatum only functions when the target has no realistic alternative. The moment an alternative exists, even an imperfect, difficult, demanding one, the entire architecture of coercion begins to crack. This is why 3 words carried the weight they did. Canada is ready was not a boast. It was not defiance for its own sake. It was a precise, evidence backed statement of fact, delivered by someone who knew in granular detail exactly what had been built, what agreements were in place, what contingencies had been stress tested, and what the realistic trajectory looked like even under sustained economic pressure. The composure behind those words was not the composure of someone choosing to appear unafraid. It was the composure of someone who had genuinely done the work required to not be afraid. And that difference is one that experienced observers can detect immediately, even through a television screen. What the world witnessed then was not a moment of political theater. It was the visible tip of weeks of invisible labor. It was the culmination of a governing philosophy that treats preparation not as a contingency, but as a primary obligation. The belief that leadership means anticipating the pressure before it arrives and constructing the conditions under which your nation can face it with its dignity and its options intact. The loudest ultimatum in the room was silenced, not by a louder response, but by a quieter truth that the target had seen it coming, had refused to wait passively, and had spent every available moment becoming harder to coerce. In the end, what this entire episode etches permanently into the record of modern geopolitics is a lesson so fundamental that it should have never needed demonstrating. Yet here it is, demonstrated with breathtaking clarity for every nation, every leader, and every government that has ever sat across the table from a more powerful adversary and wondered whether standing firm was even an option worth considering. The answer, delivered not through bravado or bluster, but through disciplined, patient, unglamorous preparation, is an unambiguous yes. Power in its most primitive form announces itself. It arrives with noise, with ultimatums, with a calculated display of leverage designed to make resistance feel irrational before it has even been attempted. That form of power is familiar, well documented, and, for a very long time, remarkably effective. But it carries within it a structural vulnerability that the most dangerous opponents have always known how to exploit. It relies entirely on the target's paralysis. The moment the target moves, prepares, adapts, and builds alternatives while the ultimatum is still being polished, the entire mechanism begins to hollow out from the inside. Mark Carney did not win this moment in front of the cameras. He won it in the weeks before, in rooms that no journalist photographed, in conversations that no analyst transcribed, in decisions made quietly and deliberately by a leader who understood that the real battle was never going to be rhetorical. It was always going to be structural. And structural battles are won long before they become visible. What makes this conclusion so significant is not simply that Canada held its ground, it is that it held its ground elegantly, efficiently, and at a cost low enough to sustain. That combination, that rare alignment of strategic foresight, diplomatic groundwork, and composed public execution produced something more powerful than any counter-ultimatum could have. It produced credibility. And credibility, once established on the world stage under genuine pressure, compounds. Other nations are watching. Other leaders are taking notes. The blueprint has been laid out in plain sight, not in a textbook, not in a think tank paper, but in real time, against real stakes, with real consequences that were navigated and absorbed without flinching. The world does not often get to watch preparation defeat pressure so publicly, so cleanly, and so completely. But when it does, the image tends to last. Washington came with the full weight of its economic leverage, its tariff architecture, and its assumption that dependence would guarantee deference. It was met with 3 words and a silence that has since grown louder than anything that came before it. History does not always remember the ultimatum, but it never forgets the answer.